Everything is white supremacy or climate change, just so we're clear. I mean, at least in the minds of the left, any problem can either stem from white supremacy or climate change or both. So
the Russians are not desperate. They don't have a recruiting problem. They've had 100,000 volunteers in addition to the 300,000 reservists or more that they've mobilized.
A lot of people probably aren't aware of that, because I think when you look at it sort of on paper, you obviously have the media reports, right? Every time, Russia takes a big town, well, it's not really of strategic importance, but every time Ukraine claws back 7 inches in a major military victory. So, you see the gamesmanship happening in the media, but I'll say this as an outsider who doesn't know, and perhaps, didn't know that, hey, maybe him coming in was to bring everyone to the table in a negotiating tactic. But, you think of it like me with sort of, again, that Cold War mentality of like, the Russian army will steamroll. It's like, well, how did they not take over this country in 2 weeks, let alone, a year and a half now? To me, and maybe to the uneducated on the subject, it feels like maybe one of the bigger sort of miscalculations or underperformances of recent military history. Is that not the case, or is that also a combination of it? Did he, misjudge some of it, or is that just because, 130 billion in missiles given to a militia, can still hold back someone who's not going all out, or, using tactical nukes or whatever it may be, that next escalation where he could, again, take over the country rather quickly?
Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia is an Orthodox Christian country that is rooted in Russian nationality, history, culture, language, and ethnicity. So forget the Soviet Union. Ukraine is a brother Slavic country. The last thing Putin wanted to do was destroy Ukraine. Putin would have been perfectly happy to have Crimea recognized, to gain those equal rights for Russians inside eastern Ukraine, and to declare the place neutral, because the neutral Ukraine would have provided exactly what you're discussing. Not only a buffer for NATO and the West, a buffer for him, for Russia. He wasn't interested in any of the things that he's been accused of. That's what Professor Mearsheimer has said. Anyone who understands Russia, knows what's happened over there since 1992, gets it. All of that's over now. Your dad, President Trump, could have intervened in February or March and put an end to this quickly. And I'm confident that he would have. We would have convened talks without preconditions. We'd have come to some sort of new territorial arrangement. And I think we would have had a neutral Ukraine, which was in everyone's interest, and no war. But now those days are past. This government in Moscow, it's not just President Putin, his entire population is enraged. They don't trust anyone in the West, especially since Chancellor Merkel and now President Macron have both admitted that the so-called Minsk Accords, which were supposed to address these issues, were a facade. They were a fraud. They were designed to, quote unquote, buy time to build up Ukraine. And they built it up. That was not a militia that was defending eastern Ukraine. They were actually very good soldiers. Most are now dead. They've had 300 to 350,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers, another 300,000 or 400,000 wounded. They're now forcibly dragging old men and boys into uniform to fight. They're desperate, which is why they'll take anything they can get. The Russians are not desperate. They don't have a recruiting problem. They've had 100,000 volunteers in addition to the 300,000 reservists or more that they've mobilized. Russia's population is squarely behind Putin. What have we got here in this country? We have a divided society, divided along every conceivable issue, from economics, class, race, you name it. And this society doesn't even support the military establishment that desperately needs talent and Americans inside uniform. And this is what this administration thinks it can commit to a war? I mean, this is sheer lunacy. We need to get out of this before we're dragged into something. And the notion that we could take on the Chinese, a nation of 1.4 billion people, what do you plan to do with your military power against that? What makes you think anything we would do would influence them? And as President Trump pointed out, that's an economic competition, one that he could handle. Unfortunately, we're not even in the competition anymore. We've surrendered.
Well, the Navy has a drag queen influencer that's going to help the recruitment problem right now, Colonel. So I'm sure things will be just fine. What could go wrong?
Right. That's true. Well,
maybe Xi will laugh himself to death because I have a feeling that's probably not going to have the intended effect, or maybe it will have the intended effect, and that's just where the military is right now. But maybe talk about your military background and how did it shape your views on foreign policy? Because I know as we talk about the wars, I think your views on war and perhaps America's involvement in war have also changed, right? From some of the early sort of, Middle Eastern stuff where you were at the beginning of that to where you are now has probably grossly changed. So, how did that evolve?
Well, remember, I and most of the people of my generation, our formative experience was service in NATO, in Europe. And when NATO went away, most of us stood around in 1992, 93, 94 and said, well, NATO has to go in one of two directions. Either it becomes Europeanized. In other words, the Europeans take responsibility for themselves. We can still be a partner, or we just leave because there's no mission for us in Europe anymore. By the way, I had plenty of experience with Russian organizations and units after the fall of the wall, and I can tell you they were absolutely not our enemies. In fact, they did great work for us, particularly before we went into Afghanistan. But if I go back to the 1970s and I look at the ruins in which the military was found at that point, and then look through the 1980s where we rebuilt and we improved our position dramatically, it took very little time after 1991 for that military to be dismantled and ultimately to be ruined. And we got more and more generals and more headquarters and fewer soldiers. We lost 163,000 experienced combat soldiers in 1991 and 1992. And we kept every general officer we had on active duty and added some. This is the problem. This rot has been underway for a long time. And we've lost the discipline, the cohesion, the esprit de corps. I would say Special Operations Forces was an area where there was a holdout. And of course, the administration hates Special Operations because they claim it's another hotbed of white supremacy. So they're now talking about trying to do away with as much of it as they can.
Everything is white supremacy or climate change, just so we're clear. I mean, at least in the minds of the left, any problem can either stem from white supremacy or climate change or both. So, yes.
So my argument is in 1991, we were a very healthy organization, but we were also disappointed, many of us, because we thought that we had gone over there to fight a war and win it. We discovered after a very short period of time, hostilities were ended. And then the big lie was perpetrated that, well, we really didn't set out to remove Saddam Hussein. That's not really why we went. We just wanted them out of Kuwait, which is not true because we then began trying at every opportunity to kill Saddam Hussein wherever he went. We bombed the place into the Stone Age. So the bottom line is we stood around and said, well, wait a minute, we could go to Baghdad with 5,000 men and pick up Saddam Hussein and that bunch and put another group of Iraqi generals in charge and let the UN handle it. The last thing we needed to do was occupy anything. And of course, when we went back in 2003, originally, that was the plan. We were not going to occupy. But again, the same people that pushed nation building in Somalia, nation building in the Balkans, suddenly we were going to build a nation in Iraq. And the insanity took off from there. If we had picked up Saddam Hussein and simply said, thanks very much, we're out of here, you and I and a lot of other people wouldn't even talk about the place today. But we stayed and tried to govern it with our military. What a catastrophe. The last thing you want to do is occupy anything. Now we're trying to fight a proxy war for all the wrong reasons, and we're killing the Ukrainian nation. They're down to perhaps 14 to 18 million now from an original population back in January of 2022 of about 34 million. Everyone's left that could go. They've either gone east, almost 2 million into Russia, or 10 million west into Europe. And when you talk to them on the way out, as most of the news media have, they say, will you go back? Never. Yeah. Ukraine is the historic breadbasket of Europe. It is enormously productive. It could be the gleaming jewel economically if we had neutralized it. It could be as wealthy and prosperous today as Austria is. And that was the model. That's what we should have done. Instead, we got this terrible war. And today, Russia is not weak. Russia's military is now larger and stronger than anything that we've seen since the 1980s. Its economy is booming. And as I said earlier, 81 nations are headed to St. Petersburg in June for a major conference, the purpose of which is to bring them into this larger plan to back currency with gold. And the gold in China, the gold in Russia, the gold in India is just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. It's just the beginning. The question is, what do we do? And these people in Washington have no answers. Yeah. And that's why prices rise, services fall apart, the armed forces are in ruins, our borders are open, and there is no rule of law. We are being destroyed by this regime in Washington.